The first part of this unit is understanding that fractions, decimals, and percents are all different ways of writing equivalent values. You can change within each to one another. 1/2 can change to 0.5, and the proper way of writing it would be 0.5, which is also known as 50%. What this unit is going to be talking about is how to change and convert them between fractions and decimals and percents to one another. Because the very first thing we need to do is understand how to change these within each other so that then we could use them as functional working values. Look at this here. I want you guys to see, what does that look like to you? Some of you guys said division, and some of you guys said a fraction. You're both correct. The whole reason that they invented the division symbol to look as it does is because it's representative of a fraction. When you have a fraction, your fraction is actually a division problem. So 1/2 is really 1 divided by 2. 2/3 is really 2 divided by 3. 7/9 is really 7 divided by 9. And the reason that you need to know that it is a division problem is because that is the way to change fractions into decimals. Because a fraction is a division problem, then to convert a fraction into a decimal, you divide the top by the bottom. 1/2 is really 1 divided by 2. Long division, you add the decimal point, move it up, add an extra 0, and you do your division. 2 goes into 10 5 times, exactly, with a remainder of 0. So that's where they get 0.5. So if I was to give you the example of, hey, I want you to change 7/20 into a decimal. So listen once more. I give you 7/20, and I ask you to change it into a decimal. Then what you're doing is 7 divided by 20. Top divided by bottom, top in the house. 7 divided by 20. In order to divide, and so when you change 7/20 to a decimal, it's 0.35. Now let's look at 2 and 3/8. For some reason, our human eyes and our human brains have a hard time understanding mixed numbers and fractions because they look weird. If I was to read this, I would say 2 and 3/8, correct? Yeah. This is telling me that I have 2 whole items and 3/8 of another. So when you're seeing something like 2 and 3/8, when you go to change it to a decimal, you need to know that it is 2 and 3 divided by 8. So the only division you are creating is the 3 divided by 8, because the other part is just 2 point whatever 3 divided by 8 is. That's how we change from mixed number to a decimal. The mixed number, the whole number, stays in front, 2, and the decimal point represents and. And then 3/8 is 3 divided by 8, which is 0.375. So 2 and 3.375 is really 2 and 375 thousandths. If I ask you to change 1 and 4/5 into a decimal, everybody knows that it's 1 point something, correct? Yeah. The 4/5 is 4 divided by 5. Top divided by bottom, top in the house. Now, 5 does not go into 4. So I need to add a decimal point, and that's my 3rd and 4th grade reminders. We didn't like long division, but we got to deal with it. We got to know how to really work with it. Bring up the decimal point up top. because that's what you're supposed to do to make sure you don't lose the place value.
In the top.
You always bring it back up. And then you add a 0, because now you're not going to do 5 goes into 4. You're going to do 5 goes into 40 exactly 8 times. 8 times 5 is 40. When you subtract, you get 0. So 4/5 as a decimal is 0.8. So I'm going to put the 0.8 right after the 1, because it's 1 and 0.8. So when you are changing fractions into decimals, you divide. You guys try this one. Change that into a decimal. So right now we're just changing it into a decimal. So when I do that, I know it's 5 and, so I know it's 5 point. And I also, a couple of you were like, oh, I already know that 3/4 is like 3/4. It's literally 0.75. So if you're being asked to change 5 and 3/4, it's basically 5.75. So it's very important that you memorize some of these fractions, what their decimals are worth, because it makes it easier. You already know a lot of them. 1/4 is the same thing as a quarter, 0.25. 1/2 is half of a dollar, which is 0.50. 3/4 is 0.75. So knowing those, knowing what the fractions equivalent of the decimal is going to help you just much quicker get your answer. One-third. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to please pay attention, because I'm going to give you guys a really easy shortcut for some of these. And some of you guys are going to really appreciate the shortcuts that these will give you, so that it saves you a lot of time. Look at 1/3. When I'm changing it to a decimal, I divide. Top divided by bottom, top in the house. So follow along as I do my long division. 3 does not go into 1, so I add a decimal point. I add, I add a 0, and I bring the decimal point up. 3 goes into 10 3 times. 3 times 3 is 9. Subtract. Remainder 1, add a 0, bring it down. And then it keeps on going. And it never ends. 1/3 is a repeating decimal that is really equal to 0.3 repeating. And I can show you over and over and over again that every single fraction that has a denominator of 3 or 9 is actually a repeating decimal. If I changed 1/3 into 3/9, we know that those are equivalent fractions, right? And if I did 3 divided by 9, I would end up getting 9 goes into 30, 3 times with 27, remainder 3, keep going, and it repeats.
Wait, is it the numerator?
So it's the shortcut that the mathematicians discovered, which I think you might find very useful, is any fraction whose denominator is 9 is a repeating decimal. So for example, 2/9 is really 0.2 repeating. 4/9 is really 0.4 repeating. 5/9 is really 0.5 repeating. And if I wanted to actually check the work for any of these to show you 4/9, 4 divided by 9, bring your decimal point, add a 0, 9 goes into 40, 4 times. 4 times 9 is 36. With 4 left over, bring down the 0, and it keeps going forever and ever and ever. 5/9, 5 divided by 9 is going to be 5 repeating based on the shortcut, and I'll prove it to you.
But why?
The reason is because it's ninths as opposed to tenths. It's close to tenths. It's close to almost a whole one item.
So it's never going to be
It's never going to go correct. If your denominator is 9,
Teach us the small equal.
5 times 9 is 45. With 5 left over, bring down the 0. The 5 repeats. So any fraction that has a denominator of 9 is a repeating decimal. What is 8 ninths as a decimal? 0.8 repeating. What is 7 ninths as a decimal? 0.7 repeating.
What about 10?
Well, 10 over 9 is more than a whole, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's 1 and 1/9, so it's really 1.1 repeating.
So if it's 12 over 9, 1.2 repeating?
Well, no, you have to divide it out. If you have 12 over 9, you have to actually convert 12 ninths to a mixed number. So you would do 12 divided by 9. Or you could say, and 9 goes into 12 one time with 3 left over. Then you bring that down, and then it's going to be 9 goes into 33 times. That's the leftover, and it keeps repeating. So it's 1.3 repeating. Because 12 ninths is really 1 whole and 1/9. Or 3 ninths. Sorry. So it's 0.3 repeating. A percent per cent. Per and cent comes from hundred. In French, cent means 100. Cien in Spanish means 100. So per cent is literally saying for every 100. For every 100. So if I said to you, 5 out of 7, I would write 5 out of 7 like this, correct?
Yeah.
If I said 4 out of every 8 people, I would say 4 out of 8. Taking that perspective into percent, if I say 7%, I'm really saying 7 for every 100. So 7% means out of 100, 7 out of 100. It's a ratio that compares a number to 100. The word per means for every, and the word cent means 100. So if I said, oh, Maya got 45 out of 50 questions correct, and she wants to know what was her percent. You are changing the fraction of 45 out of 50 into a percent. First of all, 45 out of 50 would be written as 45 over 50. If I want to know how much that is out of 100, what would you think? What is the same? 45 out of 50 is the same as how much out of 100? 90 out of 100. Going back to our, in order to change a fraction, you could do whatever you do to the bottom, you do to the top. And you get 90 out of 100, which is really 90 per 100, which can also be stated as 90 per 100, which is literally 90%. That's one way of changing it. But sometimes the denominator is not easy to change into 100. And so you have to go back into understand. So if I said to you, okay, I want you to change or convert 3/5 into a percent, you first have to change it to a decimal. And how do I change fractions to decimals?
You do
Divide. Top divided by bottom, top in the house. So first I change it to a decimal. 5 goes into 30 exactly 6 times with nothing left over. So 3/5 is really 0.6, which then, in order to change it to a percent, you move the decimal 2 to the right because you want to have out of 100.
So it's 60.
So it's 60%.
Isn't that
That's exactly right. So the long way of changing a fraction into a percent is to write it as 100 out of 100, then translate it to a percent. Or if you have a decimal, all you need to do to change it to a percent is move it 2 to the right. That's it. And if you don't have a decimal, but you have a fraction, to change the fraction to a decimal, you divide, and then you move it 2 to the right. And similarly, if you're going to change a percent into a decimal, you move the decimal 2 to the left, because you're moving away from your percent symbol. When you have, for example, 45%, if I was to write that as a decimal, percents changed to decimals, you have to move the decimal place, the decimal point, 2 to the left. Because 45% means 45 out of 100, and when you write 45 out of 100 as a division problem, when you do it the long way, you are going to get, if you watch the long division, 50 bring down the 0, you are going to get 0.45. So instead of doing it the long way and having to go from, 45% to writing it as a fraction, 45 over 100, so that you could then do the long division, all of the people in charge of the mathematics rule said, oh, there is a pattern. Remember we said that when we watched the movie of the history of math, the guy said, I'm a pattern seeker. That's what mathematicians are. They seek and find patterns. There is a pattern that's involved. Anytime you have a percent and you want to change it into a decimal, when you change the percent into the fraction that it is, and then that fraction into the division that it is, they notice that, wow, 45 really has a decimal point right here. And when I went from 45 percent, what I did is I actually, to end up with the decimal point to the left, what happened was that the decimal went 2 to the left. And that's where I got 0.45. And so they said, oh, so instead of doing it the long way, just remember, when you're going to change from a percent to a decimal, you move the decimal 2 to the left. One of the things that I used to always think about is that if you're changing from a percent into a decimal, you want to get away from being a percent. You want to get away from being a percent, so you're going to move 2 away to the left. So that question that you all had on your pretest, number 3, which we're going to talk about in a minute, if you think about 0.6%, many of you guys were like, oh, it's already a decimal. But in reality, it's not, because this is
60%.
This is 0.6 of a percent. And if it's 0.6 of a percent, and the word percent means per hundred, then this is 0.6 of 100, which is 6,000ths. So just like we learned, you always, if you are a percent and you are being changed into a non-percent, you are going to move your decimal away from the percent 2 to the left. Always 2. Because percent means out of 100, and out of 100 means that you move the decimal 2. If I was to write, okay, so then the question was the following. So 0.6% is equal to 0.006, which as a fraction, and now we're going to talk about changing decimals to fractions. A decimal into a fraction, you can either memorize the place values, which personally, as a non-native English speaker, was very difficult for me. And this is one of the reasons why I learned to love math, is I didn't have to understand the language. When you look here at that 0.006, how many places are to the right of the decimal? 3. 1, 2, 3. So that means that the 6 is going to have 3 zeros, and obviously it's 1,000. So the place value that it's in tells you the denominator that it is as a fraction. If I was to read that, I would read it as 6 1,000ths. However, if you're not good with memorizing that this is the tenths and the hundredths and the thousands and the 10,000s and the 100,000s, etc., then just know that it's going to be like something with a 1 in front because it's by multiples of 10. And however many places you are to the right, that's how many zeros you need for your denominator. So that's the reason why 6/10 is really 6,000ths, but as a decimal, 6 1,000ths is really 0.006. Similarly, if we look at number 4, 455%. Again, when you're going from a percent to a decimal, you want to get away from the percent symbol. So you are going to move, and you always move 2 units. And we always move 2 units because it's per 100, and 100 has 2 zeros. And because when you do the long division, it ends up moving the decimal that way, so it's just a shortcut. 2 to the left, 455% is really 4.55 as a decimal. I also like to think about it in terms of money. The word percent has the word cent in it because cents is money. So if I was to change that 455% to 455 cents, it would be $4.55. So that's another way of remembering which direction to move it in. And then the last thing that I want to make sure that you all remember how to do is changing decimals to fractions. To change decimals to fractions, just like we did with if it's in the third place value, it's over 1,000. If it's a whole number, such as 4.55, if I was to read this, I would read it as 4 and 55 hundredths. So your actual fraction is going to have the whole number 4 still there. It's not going to get removed. The 4 wholes are still 4 wholes. And then 55 100ths, or if you don't know the place values, you know it's 55 over, and there's 2 places, so you have 2 zeros with a 1. Simplify. And then you have to always simplify, exactly. 55 and 100 are both divisible by 5. So the 4 remains. 55 goes divided by 5, 11, and 100 divided by 5, 20. Boom. That mixed number is considered a fraction. This is the fraction. That's the decimal. And that's the percent. And it's important to remember that if you are given a decimal that's also a percent, he's not considered a decimal. He's considered a percent. So to create him into a decimal, I have to move 2 to the left and then fill in your extra basket. So as a quick little practice, we're going to do these where we're going to change these percents into decimals and these decimals into percents. Then we're going to actually go back and create these into fractions. So we're going to start with these. So I'm going to go through these. To go from a percent to a decimal, I move it 2 to the left. So your decimal will be 0.27 or 0.27. Number 2, 2%. Well, the 2 is here at the end. I move it 2 to the right, and so it's 0.02. 55%, 1, 2, 0.55. 5, the decimal is there. You move it 2.05. 17%, move it 2.17 or 0.17. 98% is 0.98. Then, let's try the percent. So when you're going from a decimal to a percent, you're going to move it 2 to the right. When you went from percent to a decimal, you're going to move it 2 to the left. So this one is going to go 2 to the right because you want to add a percent symbol here at the end. So you're going to move towards that. So it's 87%. Those are 8%. 2 to the right, 42%. 4%. 71%. And 7%. Now when we look at the decimals being changed to a fraction, again, you can either remember that it's whatever the numerical word, like whatever the numbers are over the place value that they're in, or if you don't know the place values, just remember that it's going to be over either 10 or 100 or 1,000, etc. So it starts with a 1 in the denominator, and then it's the number of zeros that there are number of place values. So for this one here, the first one, if I read it properly, it's 7/10, which literally is 7/10. But if I forgot the place value, then I would be able to go, okay, it's 7, because that's what the value is, over 1 with, oh, there's only one place value, so it's 1 0. For number 2, 0.08, you could either read it like 8/100ths, or you think to yourself, oh, it's 8, because that's the value, with 2 place values, therefore 2 zeros, 8/100ths. And then we always have to simplify it. Divide by 4 to both top and bottom, and you get 2/25ths. Please remember to simplify all the way. If you do not simplify, it's not worth the proper amount. You got to make sure that you always simplify. You always want to simplify as much as possible. 42/100ths. I can divide both of those if I start off just by 2, and I get 21/50ths. 2 place values, so it's 4/100. I could divide both by 4, and I get 1/25ths. 71/100ths, because there's 2 place values. That's 71 is prime. And then 7/100ths, because it's 2 zeros.